Good evening, everyone. This is June 28th, 2017. We're at the Mindfulness Community of Milwaukee Southgate Center, the home of Stillwater Sangha. And this is the second in our series of talks about mindfulness in the Thich Nhat Hahn tradition. Specifically, we're going to talk about the problem. Last week, as you know, we found out that we were all Buddhas, and we were appreciating the fact that we were all Buddhas. And yet, all of us being Buddhas, we all seem to fall for the same trap. It's an interesting process. So what we're going to do tonight is to go over why that happens, both from a standpoint of evolution and biology, where we are with that in modern times, and we'll have a little hint about what we can do about that, although next week we'll be going into much more detail about what we can do with the problem. Before we go into that, I just want to talk about the bell. In our tradition, the bell is very important. The bell is the voice of the Buddha telling us to wake up. In fact, many of us have a situation where we have apps on our phones or on our computer that go off randomly, just doing bells to help us sort of wake up and to realize we're caught in this large thought stream. And you can get bells anywhere, you know, the bells that you get on your cell phone when it rings, for example, or a doorbell or anything, or it can be a place. In one of my old houses, I had the foot of my steps going upstairs was a bell of mindfulness. And there can be all sorts of things. But we always seem to have this really large thought stream that we're not really aware of until someone strikes a bell for us. We actually like to think of this as the voice of the Buddha. We know it would be kind of rude to have this alarm clock going off in the ear of the Buddha. So we do this very gentle way of dealing with this called inviting the bell. We just have a little bit of a wake up, almost as if we're giving a little jostle to the Buddha while he's sleeping, as opposed to a rude awakening. And we might say something like, body, breath, and mind in perfect oneness, I send my heart along with the sound of the bell. May the hearers awaken from forgetfulness and transcend the path of anxiety and sorrow. A little wake up. Listen, listen, this wonderful sound brings us back to our true home. In our tradition, we don't have a lot of ritual, we don't have a lot of form, we don't have a lot of formality, but we like the bell. And bells and bowing are the big things that we do. So, something to help you with your practice is to listen for the little bells in your life, the little things that take you out of your huge thought stream and get you back to the present moment. So, before we talk about the present day, I want to talk about the evolutionary roots of human beings, of Homo sapiens. Somewhere, and I guess now people have found fossil evidence that it may go back as far as 300,000 years ago, but certainly by 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, which is the species we are, was moving around Africa in hunter-gatherer bands. And Homo sapiens was different, mostly in its ability to impart knowledge across generations. Just one of our big things that we did. However that was done, even before there was a lot of spoken language. And human beings never, and to this day, are not the strongest creatures. We don't have the best eyesight. We depend on what we can plan, what we can do, and what we can think. So the hunter-gatherers were traveling around in bands of less than 150 people, 150. After 150 people, it seems that a group of humans start to feel strange from themselves, but they can feel like a cohesive unit with 150 or less. Some of those bands might have even been smaller. Wandering around Africa, broke out from Africa 70,000 years ago, rapidly spread all over the planet. I think they reached the last part of the world, southern South America, about 12,000 years ago. There were humans sort of everywhere. And the way life went for them was like this. If things were potentially dangerous, say you're a hunter-gatherer, and you're hearing a rustle in the bushes, you can assume a couple of different things. You can assume it might be a really good thing. Maybe this is a small animal that I can kill for dinner. Maybe this is my friend Og, who has come to hunt with me. Maybe it's this woman that I can get together with, all kinds of things. And so you might approach, but the other approach might be to have the idea that maybe this is a tiger, a bear, a snake, or a powerful enemy, and therefore we should leave it alone. So if you made error number one, which was you thought it was an okay thing, and it wasn't, you were dead and you didn't pass on your genes. If you made error number two, well, perhaps you missed an opportunity and you were a little hungry, but you were more likely to survive. In this particular system of these small clans, these small groups of people, for 190,000 years at least, this is how this went. And natural selection being what it was, it has taught us to have a default setting of suspicion, fear, resentment, and instead of the possibility of cooperation, opportunity, and connection. If you just needed to connect within your group of 150 or less, that was easy. If you had to connect beyond that, that was more difficult, but you didn't need to do that. You depended on your kinsmen, your people in your particular group. That changed 10,000 years ago with the introduction of agriculture. And then everything, you could say everything expanded and became more noble, or you could say everything went to pot. However you wanted to look at it. Basically what happened is that as people had agriculture, they developed larger groups. And now if you had a group of more than 150, you had to depend on your intellect to be able to communicate and form organizations such as hierarchies and governments. You needed to be able to form various things in order to do coordinated farming, or even to have armies. And so you did all these sorts of things. So about 10,000 years ago, it became important for us to be able to learn how to connect with people. And sometimes we've done that well, and sometimes not, as you can kind of tell for how the world is. Suffice it to say that the world is moving towards more connection. It is moving towards an idea of human beings being a big one collective superorganism, similar to the way that, say, beehives or anthills are. Everybody is connected. Everything depends on everything else in this era that is called the Anthropocene, i.e. the man-related period of time. We have more power with that. And hopefully we won't blow ourselves up or have an eco-catastrophe. But even before that, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha even realized that we had to go away from connection. We had to go away from separation and on towards connection. He had this idea that something was amiss in always being in friction with other people. and that it was true that the default setting was a mode of survival when you were a hunter-gatherer, of being suspicious and fearful of the unknown. Now it was a way for you to fall behind, because the unknown is where all of the progress that human beings could make was happening. So suffice it to say that one of the reasons that we suffer, even today, is that evolution turns, it's a very big boat. It's a very hard to turn on its path. And we are presently living in a modern world where connection is important, for the hunter-gatherer brain, where suspicion, fear is the most important thing. So you may notice that your default setting may often be to be fearful or anxious or concerned, at times even when you rationally know that you don't necessarily need to be. So this is one of those things that has come about. But like I say, it was well on its way even during the Buddha's time, which was 7,500 years after the agricultural revolution. As we remember from last week, the Buddha went off and he sat under the Bodhi tree, and he had this revelation about what the world was about. The interesting things that he found, that he said in his first talk, The Turning of the Wheel Sutra, was, what we talked about last week, was the middle way. That the idea of a sort of always giving in to your sensory impulses was a bad idea, and always denying your sensory impulses was a bad idea, and that there had to be sort of a middle path. The third thing that he said, before I get to the second one, was that all things that are assembled fall apart, which is interesting, how everything is impermanent, which many people would feel as despair. When we were talking about the 5 remembrances, the fourth one was, everything is of the nature to change. Wow. That can be really exciting. I know that if people were not of the nature to change, I would still have a 14-year-old teenage daughter living in my house, and I would suffer. Given the fact that no longer exists, that she's evolved, it seems to be a little better. So we always have that hope that things can change. And yet, even though we know that things can change, even though we know that that's the way it is, we want things to stay the same so much. If we have something that we're well grounded in, we don't want anything ever to change. So it's a quandary living in this modern world where connection can bring us so much happiness, living with the brain of the hunter-gatherer. This is what we were doing. So the Buddha looked at it very, very simply in the kind of thing that is also part of that first sermon, called the Four Noble Truths. I want to parenthetically say that the Four Noble Truths were borrowed from Ayurvedic medicine, which was around at that time and is still very existent today in India, where you have an idea about a diagnosis, a cause, a prognosis, and a cure. So this idea that was put forth was the first noble truth. It's a noble truth. It's a truth that has great meaning and import. Was there is suffering. This is not like there might be suffering, or if you don't play your cards right, there will be suffering. This is really the actual truth, that being born as a human being on this planet, there will always be suffering. Wow. But the second noble truth was that the suffering that we have is related to how we look at the world. So going back to that, we want things to be a certain way. We suffer because we don't want certain things that are happening to us, and we don't want other things to go away. Or we're unaware of things that might be going on because we just aren't paying attention. These fall into the three broad categories of attachment, aversion, and ignorance. I want to make it clear that when I say ignorance, it isn't exactly the idea of not knowing something, as we commonly use the word ignorance. It actually comes from a root of being something that we truly are not paying attention to, almost intentionally. We don't want to know. So if Jim wants to tell me, if Jim asks me if I know what the capital of Bolivia is, and I say, I don't know what the capital of Bolivia is, that might be ignorance. But if Jim says, well, I'm going to tell you the capital of Bolivia, and I put my fingers in my ears, that's ignorance. We're ignoring it. So what are we ignoring? Well, we're ignoring the life lesson that comes about all the time. And this is where mindfulness comes in. This is where mindfulness is. We just pay attention to the world around us. We will get the great sort of peace that we have. So if you look at, there's a little chart here about the Four Noble Truths. The cause of the Four Noble Truths classically has been called clinging. And the third noble truth is that the prognosis is good, suffering can end, and the cure is the path. And the further explanation that I like is that suffering is caused by something is wrong. I think it's on the back there. That's the most obvious thing, isn't it? Something is wrong, something we don't like. And again, the idea of lethargy, having an idea of not wanting to do anything, ignorance or desire, craving, all of those things lead to not seeing things clearly. Our great teacher, Thich Nhat Hahn, has said, with perception there is deception. So it really is tricky to actually do that kind of thing where we look and see how things are. And the third noble truth is it doesn't have to be. That we can change that. And then, another part of the history of the Buddha is they loved to make lists. They are the USA Today of philosophers. They make lists for everything. A lot of that was because the society was pre-literate, and it's easier to say, oh yeah, there's an eightfold path. Maybe I can remember 8 things. But it was also the idea that the Buddha didn't want anything written down when he died. He wanted people just to seek them out. So just as making the list, they're right in front of you: wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. If you were a smart person and you were trying to figure this out, you might come up with a list of 6 or 7 or 9 that is a little different than that. But he was trying to be the way of kind of being inclusive. But the further explanation, and the one that I want to talk to that was related to what I was saying before, is we want things, the real cause of suffering is we want things to be other than they are. So we suffer if we're a Green Bay Packer fan and they lose, We suffer if we're trying for that promotion at work and we don't get it. We're suffering if someone forgets our birthday that we expected that they should know it. All of these sorts of things. And we suffer for all sorts of reasons this way, instead of just sort of going on with the idea of accepting. I would say that probably after mindfulness, acceptance is maybe the best and most important part of the particular path. And we'll certainly talk a lot more about acceptance when we talk about the next week's lecture will be on the solution to the problem. But this is the trap that everybody falls into. Everybody. And that's why even though you are all Buddhas, and you are all Buddhas, you all fell for this particular trap, which is ego, egocentrism, having this clinging, wanting these things that are related to your individual self. And as we talked last week, it's also in the handout from last week, that this happened really at an early age. We talked about the toddler's rules of possession. I mean, that's really the second noble truth, isn't it? It's wanting things, wanting things, wanting things. The human mind, quite frankly, this biological construct, this piece of cauliflower in our head, is always wanting and is never satisfied if we let it be it that way. We have to sort of take a different approach with that. We have to become comfortable with our not getting what we want. We have to sort of tone down our feelings and our desires. There are many people out there that you see right now who might be what we call hungry ghosts. Have you ever heard the term hungry ghosts? Their bellies are huge and their throats are very narrow. They're always hungry because they can never get enough. And I think that we have almost an epidemic of hungry ghosts in our society. Have you ever seen so many people that just never seem to be able to get further along in their particular profession, or they're climbing a ladder of success, whatever that is, including such things as academic success, and they've always got to go to the next level? And isn't that what we often try to do? Whenever we don't think that we're doing well, we have to get another little intellectual thing. We have to add something to what we already have instead of just saying, where we are is just fine. So the real part about that that's really interesting is your suffering is caused entirely by you. Now, I know a lot of people like to think that that's really a big guilt trip. The idea behind your suffering is caused by you. You did this. You're the person wanting. You're the person not wanting. You're the person ignoring. But I'm telling you, it's a universal trap. It's something that everybody falls into. Isn't it interesting that the other thing that kind of goes that way is discernment? We get into a lot of suffering because of discernment. We say we like things and we don't like things, and that leads to suffering. Shakespeare said that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. If you want to take, and I know that it wasn't a Buddhist text, but if you want to go back to Genesis in the Bible, what was the downfall of Adam and Eve? What was their original sin that we continue to suffer as we get older? Sin being, of course, that I like the Greek term for sin. It translates as missing the mark, rather than it's this big stain on your soul. Missing the mark shows a little sign of ignorance, doesn't it? Well, Adam and Eve fell out of favor because they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Isn't that interesting? Discernment was what caused their suffering. It caused them to fall out of Eden. This idea. So we do so much evaluation, so much things, so much judgment, so much of putting things into categories, even when we know that that might cause us to suffer. And it's a difficult uphill struggle. I find that most people that I know who practice with me all feel that judgment is a bad thing, that we should have more non-judgment, and yet they feel everybody should vote. So I don't know how that all goes. Those are a little bit contradictory in terms. The more that we can kind of keep that even keel of at least being aware that we are discerning, then I think the better we will be on towards the path of liberation. So it's your fault. You did it. You want, you don't want. You ignore, you have clinging, you like this, you don't like that. You separate things into two categories all the time, and this causes your suffering. And I'm not trying to do this to chastise you. Like I say, even though you're all Buddhas, you all fell for the same trap. Sad. However, The third noble truth is what's really interesting to me. The third noble truth is really the one that is really very, very poignant. You are the cause of your suffering. However, you and only you are the solution. When I say only you, I don't mean that you can't get tremendous amount of help. And I think in the fourth lecture in this series, we're certainly going to talk a lot about such concepts as the common good and that connectiveness that I hinted about before. But it's really true. You can achieve this liberation. You can achieve this thing that the Buddha and others called enlightenment. You can do it right here, right now, in this lifetime, in the next moment even. If you practice, if you pay attention, this will happen. And it's an uneven process, and it's a process that is fraught with many failures and maybe few successes at times. But this is definitely available to us all. The third noble truth says, you can conquer this problem. You can end your personal suffering. Not only your personal suffering, but you can end the suffering of people around you. And it's a really odd thing, too, because most people have this idea, even as I say that, you might be saying, wow, where can I do a seminar on that, you know? What kind of book, what can I read? Can I read a bunch of books? Can I memorize a particular sutra or something along those lines? The real key to this is mindfulness. It's just paying attention. And that seems really peculiar. There should be more to it than that. There should be something really austere and difficult. You should have to, walk through the snow in your bare feet for 20 miles. You should do something along those lines. And while, of course, indulgences are the other part of the idea that the middle way is wrong, the idea is just to pay attention to the very ordinary stuff. I saw it on one of my little Zen calendars, which said something like, ordinary people could dream of extraordinary events and images, while the extraordinary, the enlightened people dream of the very ordinary. It's that it really is one of those things that goes on that happens with that little New Yorker cartoon. There's an older monk. He's sitting there with the younger monk, and they're just sitting in meditation. And there's that peculiar little look that the younger monk's looking like, what's going on? And the older monk says, this is it, nothing happens. This is really it. But I wouldn't say nothing happens. I would say when we get to revel in the ordinary is when we really feel wonderfully alive and happy and connected. But it takes practice, because in order for us to feel wonderful, alive, and present, we have to get into the idea that the rustle in the bushes may not necessarily be our enemy. We have to get used to the idea that there is not wolves at the door all the time. That fear and anxiety are things that we are more likely to create than our world is creating. And we can step back from that and decide not to be that way. But it takes practice, and it takes that kind of idea about mindfulness. The Eightfold Noble Path is really nice. I just want to say, in case people are looked at this and scholars and that sort of thing, we have this problem in 20th century, we probably have this problem less than, say, people who don't speak English, but the problem with 20th or 21st century Dharma is all of these words are words that were discovered and expounded by 19th century British anthropologists. They found these words and said, oh, what are we going to call? So Smrti, for example, is the term for mindfulness. So we know that that's a problem, because even though it kind of says what we want to say, paying attention, it gets the idea that everything is caught between our ears rather than, say, mindfulness of other parts of our body, mindfulness of touch, mindfulness of movement, mindfulness of emotions, all those kinds of things that are very body-centered, so we don't have those kinds of things. So getting back to that, the translation of this word samyak, which came about as right, seems really kind of odd because things like right view, right intention, right speech. Well, sometimes right speech is, one thing, and another time it's another thing. So if you saw, if you were protecting somebody from somebody who was trying to do them harm, giving them refuge in your house, and the person knocks on the door, the truthful thing to say they're here would be a disastrous thing to do, so you would say something different. So to some extent, the things like view, intention, speech, what have you, are all related to the time that it goes on, and that's another thing about being mindful. You're much more likely to make the wise decisions. I saw another list of this that said instead of using the word right or wise, they used the term sound. Isn't that a nice word? Sound view, sound intention. And you could take any of those actually and make a whole path out of it. For example, I think intention is so important. I think that if you just decide, even if you stumble, even if it seems like you're not getting anywhere, if you just decide that you're going to make an effort to live a mindful life, you will. It may have ups and downs, and of course, sometimes we like to compare ourselves to others, but comparisons are odious. And we just need to sort of do on our own particular path. The present day, nowadays, that people talk about the Buddhist path, and Thich Nhat Hahn talks about this quite well as a tripod, are the three parts of the Eightfold Noble Path. There's wisdom, which is actual knowledge that you might have. Morality, living the kind of thing where we don't do harm to ourselves or others. And meditation. And all three of those things are useful. And they work like a tripod if you were putting a tripod up for a camera. Right? If one leg was a lot longer or a lot shorter, it would be unsteady. I find that most people who I run across in this path and the reason they come to a place like this center is because the leg that is the meditation leg is a little short. I mean, so many people, you may know people like this. They come on, oh, well, I've read this book and that book, and they can tell you 20 Dharma books they've read, and they don't seem like they're getting much progress. And you say, well, how much do you meditate? Well, just a little bit, but I read a lot. And I make it a sort of rule for beginners in my classes that I teach that you should never read more than you meditate, or to spend intentional mindfulness. Meditation, I think, is just intentional mindfulness. Unintentional mindfulness would be something like when the bell goes off. Boom, where was I on that thought stream? So the other thing, I want to bring the fifth column onto this little handout here to bring that into play too. Although it's also been called the truth of suffering, that there is suffering, and that there's an eightfold noble path for the cure. Thich Nhat Hahn says an eightfold ignoble path for the truth of suffering. And that instead of saying suffering can end, which of course is really true, the idea that well-being can come to the fore. The truth of well-being is often brushed aside. Unfortunately, we Buddhists, as I said with the 5 remembrances last week, we get a bit of a bum rap, but a lot of it's our fault because we talk about suffering. Suffering. And the first noble truth is always considered to be suffering. Actually, when Thich Nhat Hahn rewrote this in his book about the Buddha Dharma called The Heart of the Buddha, it was the first noble truth was the truth of well-being. Isn't that great? You have well-being. No matter who you are, no matter how bad your life is, you have well-being. There are things that are right with you. John Kabat-Zinn often says, there's more right than wrong with you, no matter who you are. And he is a person who is knee-deep in the sickest of the sick. He'll say, no matter who you are, there's always some joy. You can always taste the tangerine. You can always see the sunset. And even if you don't have particularly good vision and can't do that, you can hear the beautiful music. You can feel the touch of a loved one. There's always some well-being out there. And we need to touch that. So this sounds really, really easy and simple. It's simple, but it's not easy. I often like to say that this path is hard, but it's not hard like physics is hard. Although there are people who will talk about long lists of the 9 jhanas and the 8 bhumis and all these other sort of strange states, which quite frankly I have let go of. They can make it seem like it's a complicated process, like physics, And there are, believe me, there are huge volumes. The volumes of Buddhist texts that are considered to be old sutras is roughly 10 times the size of the Bible. There's lots that you could read and to study and dissect. But it's not hard like physics is hard. It's hard like shoveling snow is hard. Shoveling snow is hard. But why is it hard? It's not a particularly challenging thing intellectually. You just put the shovel on, you stick it in the snow, you throw the snow. It's easy to know how to do it intellectually, but you got to do it again and again and again. And there are times when you will ache, and there are times when you'll feel tired, and there are times when you'll say, "Oh, screw it, shovel the driveway's good enough. Let's go in and have some hot soup." But this is also the kind of path it is. When you are going on this particular path, it is, quite frankly, the idea that just keeping on, that persistence, that intention, is so important. So I have to admit, I've made this very simple. And in reality, it is very simple. Your suffering is caused by you, and the solution is up to you as well. And the path before you is pretty clear. And yet, we have a lot of difficulties doing it. That little part of our brain, that hunter-gatherer brain, or that brain that really wants to defend the ego, to keep this organic being going at all costs, is very persistent and does not give up. People have often heard the term that fear conquers love. And I think actually in our very basic state, in our very immature state, and perhaps even in our hunter-gatherer state, that may have been true. But I don't think that's a sentence that we need to live up to. I think we can reverse that. As a matter of fact, this process of mindfulness is reversing that, so that love can conquer fear. Thich Nhat Hahn talks about the greatest gift that we can give to somebody is the gift of non-fear. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't you like to have that under your Christmas tree? Open up a little box of non-fear. And you get it by just kind of doing the practice. So I've outlined that it's easy, and I've outlined that there aren't a lot of real things that you kind of need to do except just keep doing that. But next week, I will kind of go into more of a blueprint, more of a step-by-step thing about how to do this. Because it's not really obvious. Everybody says, well, pay attention. When I was a kid, they'd tell me to pay attention. And no one ever told me how to pay attention. I'd say, I guess I wasn't paying attention. But we can develop those skills. We can develop all those skills, but we do need a little bit of a foundation for it. We do need a little something to understand why we're continuing. We are causing our suffering, and yet we continue to do it. Why are we doing that? And next week we'll talk about not only why we are doing that, But how we can reverse that process and get to the true idea. The true idea is not just that we're all Buddhas, but that we're all connected. They aren't inseparable things. They aren't inseparable things. The idea that you're a Buddha and you connect work out very well together. And we'll figure out how we can best do that. So thank you for your precious time tonight. It's always hard to give up a good summer night in Milwaukee, and I hope no one gets hit by a tornado. Oh, I just triggered somebody's hunter-gatherer mind there, didn't I, by doing that? So, before we end, are there any questions? Any questions about what I've talked about? Yes. Right, and actually a little bit of wise speech. I meant those, I didn't do that as well as I wanted to, but speech kind of overlaps into both wisdom and morality. I'm sorry, so I'm taping this. The question was about the particular categories of wisdom, morality, and meditation. Yeah. That's a very good question. The question is, how do you determine the difference between mindfulness and concentration? Mindfulness is accepting what is happening at the present time, no matter what. Concentration may also be that, but it may also have intention when you decide to do that. For example, people will do such meditations as loving kindness meditation, wonderful practice. They're doing that with concentration because they've decided that's the particular object that they would like to go with there. So they do go very much hand in hand. But if you wanted to say mindfulness is more open to what is the world presenting to me right now, and concentration is more what do I want my mind to be doing? It's more like intention in action. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for braving the storms and coming out here tonight. And next week we're going to talk about the idea of what's the solution to this particular problem. It really was kind of an odd thing that the Buddha found this out, and if he didn't have a solution, it would have been really a bummer. So there is a way. There is a way out of this badness. The other thing that we often do, and I'll end with the bell for this, there's a wonderful little saying that we go whenever you see people bowing to each other in this tradition, which is a lotus to you, a Buddha to be. I sometimes say that, but actually sometimes to myself I say, a lotus to you, a Buddha you are. You don't have to go to be anything. You're already a Buddha. So maybe we can all start acting like one.